What's going on there, fellas? Welcome back to the channel. Today is Hot and Cold Takes number 8, where you guys give me your controversial strength training, nutrition, strength sport, whatever kind of training related opinions. I let you know whether I agree, whether I disagree, maybe provide some nuance, use them as a little segue to talking about some nuances of training and nutrition that might be a little bit of fun. And then I also give out the coveted Hot Take Award. To qualify for the Hot Take Award, it has to meet the criteria of being generally or genuinely controversial among people that at least kind of know what they're talking about. So it doesn't qualify if people that know nothing about lifting think something. I don't think that really qualifies. If everybody that knows a little bit kind of agrees with you, it's not probably controversial enough for this coveted award. And then I also have to agree with it. So genuinely controversial, and I agree with it. I'll give you out the fancy Hot Take Award. Kirsten has put together some to ask me, so we're going to get right into that. Go ahead.
Floor press should be a competition lift. Bench press is arbitrary.
I mean, maybe that would meet the criteria of controversial. Lots of people like the bench press. Lots of people don't like the bench press. But that point could be made about literally anything. The exact same point could be turned around and said floor press is arbitrary. Every exercise is arbitrary. Unless we're doing some like Basque strongman style tasks that are like modeled after field work that we're all doing. All of the lifts we pick as our gauges of strength are going to be kind of arbitrary, and they could absolutely be swapped to something similar.
Maybe the argument is that you avoid some of the gaming.
But yeah, but some people, a floor press touches their chest. You know, it's like you could still arch. It's like if you touch your sternum before the floor, like people would find ways to game the lift like anything else. People would figure out ways to bounce it off the floor a little bit more or something. Could you switch it to floor press? Yes, it is arbitrary, but I don't think you qualify for the hot take medal because I think that point could be raised of anything, so it's not really unique to the bench press. I don't know. It is arbitrary, but I don't think it's a horrible test of overall upper body pressing power because the strength lifting guys were like, oh, bench press is a bad gauge of upper body strength because you can arch. We're going to replace that in strength lifting with the overhead press. And then we're just going to arch on the overhead press. It's like, okay, I don't know what we're doing here. I thought that defeated the purpose of swapping out the bench press. Go ahead.
Strength pill greater than aesthetic pill. Although the pursuit of raw numbers is seen as useless to some, it only makes it that much more of a true and non-externally motivated endeavor.
I don't know. I think a lot of people are externally motivated because they're going to get likes on Instagram when they hit XYZ big lift. I think that's part of the reason you'll see people game certain lifts where, okay, well, I'm going to pull sumo on a deadlift bar. I'm going to use bumper plates so the weights are way out towards the end. That way we're getting as much flex out of the bar as possible. And then I'm going to put on figure eights where my fingers are barely in contact with the bar to where the lift is unrecognizable. It's not preparing me for a powerlifting competition, but I can take advantage of the fact that most people don't know what they're looking at, and they're going to think my 800-pound deadlift is the same as another 800-pound deadlift, even though I'm gaming it, and I would be struggling to hit 7 in a meet. So I think, there's tons of external validation when chasing numbers.
And I would argue those people are not truly strength-pilled. If you were strength-pilled, you would deadlift conventional.
You heard it here. I don't know. I think there's a lot of merit in saying that you're training. Maybe we should focus more on outputs. So people would say, oh, well, if you number chase, that probably would incentivize just getting disgustingly fat and out of shape in the chase of one big 1RMs. And I would say, well, we can add in endurance-related metrics to the outputs that we're chasing, right? We appraise our body off of what it's able to do rather than how it looks. I think for a lot of people, that's a lot mentally healthier for whatever that's worth. It's more objective, which is nice. We can measure improvement a little bit easier than we could. So obviously, I'm showing my hand. I kind of agree with you. Obviously my training centers a lot more around outputs. It's like I want to have these measures of my endurance, of my strength, of my, all of these, my power output. And I want to see numerical improvements in these. And I kind of gauge whether I'm happy with my body based on what it can do rather than how it looks. So in that regard, I agree. But I'm not going to give you a hot take medal because I feel like most people here are going to agree with you on that one. And, I don't know. I don't think it's objectively better. If you find fulfillment in just trying to build bigger muscles and what really you enjoy, like if you might be a guy who trains in a hoodie always. You're not looking for external validation, but trying to pursue physique you're happy with is what brings you joy. There are plenty of guys I know who are some of the most jacked guys I know are always wearing they're always covered up at the gym, because it isn't about external validation. It is just as much an internal quest for something they find interesting and pushing themselves hard and seeing what they can do and being meticulous with their diet. So I don't really think one is inherently better than the other, though I fall into the strength enjoyer camp with you.
Bench press sucks. Dips would be better if the loading wasn't so tedious. And then someone below him asked how much he benches.
I don't know why dips would be any better. You can game a dip. If you watch guys who are really good at dips and actually watch the weight, how far that's moving, the range of motion is not phenomenal. Yeah, you can watch the top of their shoulder joint is moving a reasonable distance. You're like, oh, it's much better standardized than a bench press. Because we have depth, kind of like a squat. We're trying to get the rear delt below the elbow. But if you watch how far the weight is being displaced, people get better and better at moving their body to reach that depth standard, more so than moving the center of mass of the weight. So there's gaming going on just the same as there is on a bench press. And also, the nice thing about the bench press is you can choose not to game it, just as you could choose not to on a dip. I think both are good gauges of pressing power. I like that if we assume we're doing them with a large range of motion, the range of motion for a bench press is going to be longer. I do like that, but I like both lifts, but I don't necessarily agree that the dip is just inherently better. Both lifts can be gamed. Both lifts could be done properly and are phenomenal developmental tools. Both lifts, if done a certain way, are a phenomenal gauge of general upper body pressing power. I do think that the argument, the bench press is the king of upper body presses. There's no reason it's all that much more of a true gauge of pressing power than an overhead or a dip. But I think they're all great exercises, and I don't think one stands head and shoulders above the others, at least in my mind. What would the next one be?
AMRAPs for the first set instead of the last, which is interesting.
Interesting.
For instant feedback instead of feedback for the next week when you do an AMRAP the last set.
Yeah, so doing your AMRAP off the bat does give you a good gauge of progression, right? We can see if those numbers are going up, right? Whereas if we're doing the AMRAP at the end, we have some variable pre-fatigue there. So it maybe might obscure whether we're seeing some amount of week-to-week forward progression on that specific motion. So doing the AMRAP off the bat is a good gauge, especially we can... Not that 1-rep max calculators are all that valuable in actually predicting your max, because people are wildly variable in their ability to do reps at different percentages. But who's to say I hit an 8-rep PR and I hit a 5-rep PR? Which of those is better? Well, that's where a 1-rep max calculator can come in handy. I don't use it to predict what I could do for one, but I do sometimes use it to gauge whether I'm seeing forward progression. And plugging what you get on an AMRAP into a 1-rep max calculator and plotting that over time to kind of see if we're moving forward is a great thing to do. But if we're doing the AMRAP first, usually I would drop the weight back so it becomes a top set back off system rather than straight sets leading with an AMRAP. You could do that. Some people have great work capacity and their ability to duplicate efforts is really good. I have done that in the past. I get the argument you're making to do it first, but I would usually see a 10% drop back, even just a 5% drop back in load for the subsequent sets, and it becomes a top set drop back system. And we can kind of get those same benefits of doing the AMRAP first, using that as a gauge to see, hey, are we kind of hitting the right combo here? Is the amount of volume I'm doing, the intensities I'm doing, the sleep I'm doing, and the nutrition I'm doing, is that kind of moving me in the right direction? Am I generally trending forward on the E1RMs projected? So we're kind of, instead of waiting till the end of a training cycle to decide if what we did was appropriate, we can kind of check in a little bit each week.
This is interesting. It's a popular one too. Periodization is overrated, and getting in appropriate and repeated stresses consistently over time can be a good way to train. He mentions Will Rattel.
Well, I love Will Rattel. Does he say whether it's for hypertrophy or strength training?
He says not powerlifting, but strength and hypertrophy.
Okay, so, I think that it could be overrated. It depends on who you ask. Did I give a hot take or what was the last one?
The AMRAP's the first set or the last.
Oh, you're close to a hot take. I do think you're onto something there that I don't see talked about quite as much, which is doing the audits a little bit more frequently to gauge the efficacy of our program, but no hot take award. As far as periodization being overrated, it depends on how someone's rating it. I would say it's probably kind of correctly rated by most people, which is hey, that can be the extra 20%. 80% is going to be just getting in there and working hard on a consistent basis, right? We're going to get a good, the 80-20 rule is like whatever, 80% of the results come from 20% of the effort, and then the remaining 20% of the results come from a lot more effort. So getting those initial, like low-hanging fruit gains, a lot of that comes from just getting into the gym regularly. A lot of that comes from then working hard on an appropriate-ish amount of volume. And then a lot of that comes down to establishing the outside the gym habits of eating and sleeping right. And it's like Ronnie Coleman didn't have any real periodization. Could he absolutely have been better if there was some periodization present? Sure, but how much better would he be? Yes, it would be some amount, but we're getting the majority by checking all of those big foundational boxes first. That's not to say periodization isn't worth it, but I would look for an athlete to kind of nail those initial factors before we start leaning into that. Once they've got those down. So I would say it's not overrated. I think some people like say it's like super necessary and that like if you're not periodizing, you're screwed. I don't know. I know a lot of people that have worked their way up to like a 405 bench press because they're trying really, really hard. They eat a lot of food. They sleep a lot. Obviously, they've got some level of genetic prerequisite to it. And then they come up with a routine that they do week after week where they're like, I bench press and I do my drop sets and I do shoulders and I do triceps. And it's like, you can get pretty far without periodization. So I guess it depends on who you're asking. If it's someone who's rating periodization is the most important thing in the world, I would assume they understand that. If you understand periodization, you probably understand how important all of that low-hanging fruit is first, and that periodization, in the absence of those things, is not going to be all that helpful, and all of those things are going to outperform. Overall, I would say, I get where Will Rattel's coming from, which is like, hey, let's just first establish this idea of getting in the gym and placing strain on our body in a way that's kind of directed towards the adaptations we want. Let's make sure that's a habit that we're consistent as fuck with. And then we could look to periodization. That doesn't need to be a requisite when entering the training space. No hot take.
This one's interesting. Training legs hard 3 to 4 times a week doesn't have to destroy your training economy, but he advocates for picking less taxing lifts, like leg press, leg extension for quads, leg curls, good mornings for hamstrings, kickbacks and lunges for glutes, rather than restricting yourself to squat, RDL, hip thrust. He does note that he usually trains for hypertrophy and not really strength training.
Okay. So, high frequency training can be scaled for strength training as well. I think most people probably don't have the degree of variable management to really benefit from it. If you're living in a box and like your water is the exact same every day and your nutrition is the exact same every day and your sleep is the exact same every day and things are really predictable, yeah, we can scale back the amount of squatting we do in any one session and we can run up the frequency to get really skillful at this motion by practicing it often, kind of spread, like let's just say we were going to do 10 sets regardless. We can spread that across 3 to 4 sessions, or we can kind of throw it all into 1 or 2, and either can work. But as far as hypertrophy training goes, I'm not really convinced pushing most muscle groups to a 4x frequency is real. I don't know if the juice is worth the squeeze most of the time. So can you structure your program using less systemically fatiguing movements, less joint fatiguing movements, and still work hard and challenge a muscle 3 to 4 days per week? Yes, you absolutely can. If you guys follow my channel, you've probably heard me say the human body can adapt to a lot of things. We can adapt to doing a very wide variety of tasks and recovering from certain things if we ease into it over time. The question is not, can we train the body to recover from this? Oftentimes is, should we? Is there actually a really tangible benefit we're going to get here? And I don't know, like some people say, most adaptation for a training session happens within 24 hours. We want to be hitting it 3 times per week. Maybe I could see 3. But I don't know. I think that you are absolutely correct that you can structure your training in such a way and build into it in such a way that you could challenge your legs 4 days per week. I just don't really think that challenging your legs 4 days per week, let's say the total volume is 15 sets, is really going to be that much better than 15 sets done across 3. And I believe that the research out there kind of validates that idea that it doesn't really matter how that's distributed. Maybe splitting from 1 to 2 sessions, the performance is going to be better, so that it's going to outperform the 1 session a little bit. But I don't think we're getting many benefits going from 3 to 4, even past 2. I think 2 is probably sufficient for the vast majority of people, though you are right that you can do that.
Most non-advanced lifters should actively avoid self-limiting variations. He says the biggest thing holding back a beginner is probably not getting enough raw stimulus to grow, which he argues is achieved by taking a big-ass weight through a big-ass ROM.
I like big ass weight through a big ass ROM. Trademark.
Yeah,
TM. New shit they're training shirt. Yeah, no, I don't think that's... I think you might get the certified hot take medal for the day. I think that's a pretty reasonable take. I know Paris has parroted this as well, where he says, oh, you know, if you can't bench, I don't know what Paris says, like 2 plates, 275, probably don't Larsen press, just do more bench pressing. You're probably not so effective with your leg drive that you're going to get that much out of it. Yeah, so I think that meets the criteria for controversial, because you will hear a lot of advanced lifters talking about the use of self-limiting variations. But the reason the advanced lifters often need to lean into self-limiting variations is because if they try to do the lift vanilla as often as they would like to, the systemic fatigue coming from the amount of... You know, this is we got into this in one of the questions things when someone told me fatigue is purely relative. 100% for half Thor is the same as 100% for me, is the same as 100% for Kirsten, because Paul Carter says so. And I said, I really don't agree with that. Kirsten can squat to maximum like 3 times in a session and feel relatively okay the next day. If half Thor worked up to 1,000-pound squat 3 times in a day, he might die, right? So there's relative intensity, which is the percentage, and then there's also the absolute intensity, which does have probably some bearing on fatigue, whether that be like a neural type of fatigue, holistic fatigue, whether that be like soft tissue type fatigue. So there are some implications to the absolute load, right? So when you get these guys who get very strong, the amount of damage they're able to do to their body in a singular set does tend to scale up. That's why often you'll see really strong guys doing less sets. Aside from the fact that many of them are on PDs, even the natural ones are going to do less sets, because each singular set, because they're that much more neurally efficient, the absolute intensity is that much higher, it's that much more fatiguing. So the number of them that they can do and the number of them that they need both come downward. So oftentimes you'll see lifters who start running into this issue of the amount of weight they're moving for a vanilla bench press is very taxing. And then they will start using, okay, well, I can't bench press 2 times a week. But I feel like once a week is a little bit shy. So I'll use a self-limiting variation on the secondary day, lower the absolute load. Cool, I'll use self-limiting variation. So here, advanced lifters talk about self-limiting variations. But that's what they're doing now. It's not what they did to get there, right? When the absolute load is a little bit less, they were absolutely able to handle a 2x per week bench press frequency. And that's what they did, because they could handle from it and they could benefit from it. So I agree with what you're saying. Lots of guys will lean into these self-limiting variations when they're not really needed. We could drive maybe greater neural adaptation with the greater load that come with the regular motion. We're going to drive more skill acquisition on that main motion because we're doing it more often without the self-limiting variation. And I do think that some guys run into this they get stuck in this no man's land where, because no one set is all that disruptive, because they're doing 115 pounds on their bench press for a set of 8, there's nothing wrong with that. We all start somewhere. There was a time when I was doing my sets of 8 with 115. The problem is that that's not as disruptive as the guy doing 405 for a set of 8, where that guy doing 405 for a set of 8 might be able to move on after that. You probably, because of the low absolute intensity, might need to do a greater number of sets to drive that forward adaptation with your body. Drive it far enough away from homeostasis that it elicits adaptation. We might need to do 5, 6, 7 sets of 8 down there in some cases. So some guys can kind of get stuck in this rut where no one set is all that stimulative because they're not strong enough yet. So then they need to lean into doing more sets. And that kind of same idea could apply to, hey, we don't want to artificially limit our loading too much, right? If we artificially load, if we take this thought experiment really far and we did nothing but squatting on a Bosu ball, yes, it's a self-limiting variation. It's hard, but because we've decreased the absolute loading so much, we could be getting close to failure in this really unstable setting, but because we've decreased the absolute intensity so much, even though the relative intensity for that specific variation is high, we're not likely to see forward adaptation. So that was a really long-winded and shitty way to say, I think that's a reasonable take. I do think that the heavy use of self-limiting variations is something that probably people overuse early in their training career, and they should probably just be doing the vanilla lift for practice more often and exposing themselves to those greater tonnages, assuming they can recover from it. Big caveat. Okay.
All right. Dynamic delta progression seems to be really popular among fitness YouTubers. I think it's highly overrated. Although it has utility for accessories and isolations, I found progress on my main compounds almost stalled even in a surplus. However, having a little bit of periodization in my main lifts and allowing volume and intensity to change through a training cycle has been one of the most beneficial things I've ever done for my lifts. And Bala Omni-Man adds, I will add to this hot take by saying that if you want to get strong, DDP is probably a bad way to do that as an intermediate or advanced lifter. It's skewed towards hypertrophy in his opinion and is best used developmentally rather than for performance.
Okay, I would agree with both. I would say I agree with both of you. I would say that dynamic double progression it's just a progression scheme. There's a big difference between a progression scheme and a program, right? There's some progression schemes that are relatively complex, but I wouldn't necessarily call them a program, right? I think that applying a progression scheme can totally work well on your accessories or these motions that we're rotating in and out. But this thing that we're hammering away at, our body is pretty well adapted to it. We need to start doing something a little bit more complex a lot of the time. So just like we talked about earlier, we're going to kind of take off by building these consistent habits, right? But then once we've kind of capitalized on those big rocks, we flipped over the big rocks. Okay, I get that I have to eat protein on a consistent basis. Okay, I get that I have to sleep on a consistent basis. Okay, I get that I have to train hard. We have to flip all these rocks over first. That being said, periodization does come after those rocks. It's not like a tiny rock. It's still a pretty decent sized rock. So once we flip these consistency and effort type ones, maybe technique, maybe all these basics, periodization does come along pretty early. Once we get out of these beginner phases and our body's a little bit more resilient to, the first time you bench press, it's a novel stimulus. Your body's never done this before. It's going to get better at it. You're just neurally going to get better at it. And then you do it a little bit more and you're like, I haven't done that much of it. I'm not resistant to this change yet. And the more you do it, you get the kind of the repeated bouts effect going on. Your body's a little bit more resistant to change. And then we need to get a little bit more smart with how we're exposing our body to that motion to keep driving that forward adaptation. So I would say past, beginner, early, intermediate, however the hell you want to define those things, I would say something like dynamic double progression is not how I would approach any of the key lifts I would use as my performance metrics. I do think it does skew to hypertrophy, and I do think that it works great on accessories, but for our main motions, we're going to want to start to lean into something that is a bit more periodized relatively early. Once we've kind of used up those newbie gains where any kind of general progression scheme would have worked on our main lift, once we get past that point where anything works, we might want to start leaning into and learning how we should approach a more periodized training scheme and know, okay, for like this phase, I should be working about this hard, but the difficulty should come from the number of sets I'm doing. It should be really difficult on my work capacity, but no one set should be killing me. Or maybe I should get a feel for roughly how hard the work should be in a strength phase, or roughly, let's start getting a feel for that early. So it's like once we get past that point where any general scheme works, and I do think any general scheme works just about the same for a beginner, then we should start leaning into periodization. I wouldn't necessarily really use something like dynamic double progression on my squat, my bench, my deadlift, my overhead press, my main strength lifts. Long-winded. I don't think I'm going to qualify you for the coveted hot take award, though.
All right, my phone's trying to die.
Dude, I'm babbling so bad.
My phone's trying to die,
but
there's only 3 questions left, so I'm trying to get through all of them because I like all of them.
Okay.
So
you gotta stop me from doing this. I just get going, and it's like it's nonsense.
I will give you a signal next time I start to get bored when I'm listening.
Right, good. Okay.
Pull-ups are alpha as heck and deserve consideration as a main movement on par with the power lifts, the weight lifts, and the press. The love it gets from strongman just isn't enough. He says he's better at them than any other lift.
Okay.
Me too, bro.
Well, you showed your hand why you think they're cool. I think any lift I'm really good at is pretty damn cool too. I think they're a great developmental lift. I don't necessarily think maximal strength on pull-ups correlates with as many tasks as some other things, right? It's like maximal strength on a conventional deadlift. There's a reason that's kind of what the high bar squat is to a weightlifter. The conventional deadlift from the floor is to a strongman. It correlates with enough things, and so many things are posterior chain dominant that it's just a great use of time. We should be hammering it, and it's going to help us. It's going to carry over pretty directly to a pretty wide variety of tasks that we're asked to do. 1 rep max strength on the pull-up. A lot of the guys I know that are the best at 1 rep maxes on the pull-up, it doesn't necessarily correlate to as many things because many of the tasks we're asked to do in strongman are still going to be limited by the lower back, by the core, by the hip stability, even if we are calling upon those upper body pulling muscles. And while the pull-up is a great developmental tool for those upper body pulling muscles, we're not limiting by our lower back, so we can run up a ton of volume on it. I think it's a great developmental tool. I would agree with you. that it's probably underused by strongmen, but I don't necessarily view it the same way I view as a deadlift, which is kind of a key performance metric because it's going to carry over to so many things. And even if I wasn't doing a deadlift in a show, I'd probably be deadlifting up to 3 weeks out because I do think it's so pivotal. Whereas the pull-up isn't necessarily a measure of where I'm at. It's just a tool to drive progress. But I would give you lukewarm take. You're very close. I agree it's underrated in strongman circles to train that upper body pulling musculature in a way not limited by the lower back. It works great for that. I just don't necessarily put as much weight behind a pull-up 1RM as I would some other 1RMs in terms of how many other tasks it's going to assist you in. Not to say that they're not super helpful. I don't want to sound like a pull-up hater. I think they're awesome.
We're all on team pull-ups here.
We are on team pull-ups here.
Okay, so...
Neutral chin-ups, actually, because
I like those
you can do more weight. Yeah, you can do more weight that way.
This one is interesting. It's kind of long, so I'm going to...
Paraphrase
a little bit. Cutting is arguably more important than bulking for gaining experience of exercises and planned progressions in the future. He's talking about how when you bulk, you're doing what you know will work, and you don't really deviate to find other things that might work, because if you're bulking, you're more likely to make progress, basically.
So I get what you're saying, right? It's almost an audit of really knowing you have your shit together, right? Because it's like if you're in a caloric surplus, assuming you're not really advanced, just about anything is going to work with sufficient effort applied. So you're not really auditing, really understanding what is moving the needle. What are the things like you can kind of throw the kitchen sink at things because you have these extra recovery resources at your disposal in the surplus. Whereas when you are in a caloric deficit and you're really scraping by, it really you have to prove to yourself you really know what's moving the needle and lean into those things.
He also does say that he thinks that the reason that a lot of people's cuts are miserable is because they just do all of the things that worked when they weren't cutting, and so they don't try new things. And so I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, so I guess I would agree. I would agree with you. I would say we get like a solid. We'll give a warm take award on that one because it does force you to really make sure you have an understanding of what are the important parts of your training and what are kind of unnecessary auxiliary movements that aren't doing as much. When we have these limited recovery capabilities, when we're really dragging ass into the gym, we don't have the ability to just do 100 things like we do normally. So it's going to force us to develop a better understanding and relationship with our training. In terms of gaining muscle mass, which is what most people need to do. Obviously, I know the bulk is more important than the cut, of course, right? Paris always says you're just cutting to make more room to bulk. And there's a lot of wisdom in that. But as far as what's going to force you to kind of understand your training better, I understand what you're saying, right? A surplus is almost a crutch in some ways. To not have as precise of an understanding of what you need to do to get better. So, yeah, warm take. I get what you're saying, and I do think that a lot of people would disagree with that just because they don't like that initial phrasing of cut more important than bulk.
Last one, not to bias you, but this was, I think, the most popular one by quite a margin. Feet up bench is superior to Larsen press in every way. ROM is even longer, and you can't sway your legs to get some hip in there like a lot of people do subconsciously. Bonus points for looking cooler since the dangling legs don't hit either.
All right. Controversial. Check. Absolutely. Looks cooler. I agree.
I don't feel cooler when I do feet up.
Compared to Larsen where you're starfishing?
Oh, that's fair. I point my toes too, so I look really stupid.
No, I literally, there was a time when I was in college where I chose to do feet up over Larsen. Because I just liked how it looked more and I didn't want to look like a goober starfishing on the bench.
Are we talking feet in the air or feet on the bench?
Either or. I did it because I felt for me they were comparable. I was able to achieve the same level of arch either way personally. I know some people use the weight of their legs hanging down to pull them into a bit of an arch. The range of motion could be a slight bit smaller because when we bring up our thighs, we're kind of posteriorly tucking that pelvis and we're going to reduce the arch a little bit. I found I was able to arch about the same either way. Some people do find they can get a bigger arch Larsen. So if your goal is reducing the arch as much as possible, the feet up makes sense. And I just thought, I was like, okay, these are about the same for me. My maximal loads are about the same. I'm just going to do the one that looks cooler. So I was always doing a bunch of feet up in my school gym because I thought it looked cooler. So I agree with you there. I'm sure some people disagree, but I agree with you that it looks cooler. I would say Yeah, you can kind of flex your glutes off the chest on the Larsen, but how much that's actually helping you, it's probably not that much. I probably wouldn't worry about that, especially if you're being diligent about doing a soft touch. Not that everybody should soft touch. Lots of great benchers bench with a sink. But if we are doing a soft touch, the ability to flex your glutes doesn't really matter. But I think that the one problem, and I say this as a massive fan of feet up bench press, is that for some people on the skinnier benches that their gym have, it's almost one deviation too unstable, where we are constantly having to worry about we're kind of having to worry about balance. Whereas if we have our legs out in a Larsen style, just by kind of widening our ability to kind of control our center of mass, kind of like outriggers, we're able to make it so that, okay, we have only a positive amount of instability where we're forced to slow down the negative just a little bit and keep our bar path just a little bit better. And we can't rely on our negative to bail us out of the fact that we're not in a good bar path by kind of shoving the bar back out of this bad touch point that we did. So it's enough instability to keep us honest, enough instability to kind of get some of these benefits. We don't get the assistance of the legs, but it's not so unstable that we're having our set limited by kind of sliding off to the side, which some people, depending on the equipment you're benching on and your level, might find is an issue on feet up. I'm going to give you a certified, absolutely warm take just because I really like feet up bench press. I think it's cooler. Freaky D, we're going to have to duke it out one of these days for the official feet up versus Larsen title. But I would say that some people do run into an issue, and Larsen is the better option, especially on worse equipment. But even just regardless, there's a certain amount of instability that might pose a positive training benefit, like using some dumbbells, and then we take it too far. It's so artificially limiting that at best it's a motor learning tool and not really a great strength stimulus, and at worst it's useless, right? Like we all kind of agree, squats on a Bosu ball, probably a bad use of time. I think people are kind of coming to the point where they're like, maybe hanging bands from the bar with weights on them to do squats or overhead presses. Yeah, okay, I can see a place as a motor learning tool. I think Bromley mentioned he felt like, it taught him like a little bit more about his bar path on overhead press. Sure, super self-limiting. If we wanted to overhead press for a fourth time this week, but we could not do anything else, could be a self-limiting variation for more motor learning, but we're probably not going to get much stronger from it. So we got this idea, but like dumbbells, just a little bit less stable. I'll probably offer some positive benefits. My negative on my bench press always feels better when I'm training dumbbell bench press because of that slight instability. So there's probably an amount like less stable that's good, and then if we take it too far, it's probably bad, right? Everything in moderation. And I think for some people, the feet up might be needlessly unstable. So those would be my thoughts.
Good hot takes. I liked a lot of these today.
Kirsten says they were good. That means they were good. Boss man approved.